Thank you so much. So I'm going to start with a quote. Kellie stated the aim of her 2011 book, I Minded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, like this, quote, "What I want to think about here is how art objects and the activities around their making and display in exhibitions, homes, studios, as well as their materiality and life, are integral to forming relationships, connections, and kinship among sometimes diverse constituencies. How is art a connective force, a glue between people creating the sense of community whole, but also a family and affiliation? How do objects coalesce a public, create a life for artists and audiences, and a circle of friendships from the particular to the collective?" While she was speaking particularly about the concerns of that book, I think that these are driving questions palpable in much of Kellie Jones's work, including the remarkable series of Richard Cohen lectures that we're lucky to be attending. I'm very pleased and honored to have the opportunity to introduce Kellie as she delivers her final lecture in the three-part Richard Cohen lecture series. The title of the series is Art is an Excuse, Conceptual Strategies 1968 to 83. Kellie Jones is Associate Professor in Art History and Archaeology and at the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia. She's the co-curator, among many other wonderful things, she's the co-curator of a landmark exhibition that just opened opened recently at the Brooklyn Museum on Art of the 1960s, which according to the New Yorker, by focusing on art of the 1960s via the impact of the civil rights movement, reveals, quote, an astonishing pluralism which ranges across styles, regions, and races. Also, a quote that I think carries over to describe what we've been hearing here in the Thompson Room. In her first lecture, Jones spoke about linguistic strategies in the 1960s. This concerns conceptualism in art, the way that in the 1960s, assumptions about art's materiality and visuality intersected all kinds of period obsessions with systems and information, leading to strategies in which art was dispersed into networks, reduced to linguistic statement, or subsumed into actions and their documentation. When this happened, this was often implicitly and sometimes explicitly political, and Jones brought this dimension out in all its complexity by considering parallels and differences between the conceptualism practiced by Black American artists in the 60s on the one hand and contemporaries in Mexico on the other, all in relation to speech. So the way that vernacular speech, including racial slurs, were reworked by David Hammons, the way Felipe Ehrenberg used the mail service to intervene in nationalist self-promotion at a period of censorship and suppression of speech in Mexico, and the way Adrian Piper used the withdrawal of speech, literally removing her art from the museum as the most powerful form of expression available to her at a particular moment in 1970. I couldn't be at yesterday's talk, but I understand that it dealt with multimedia installation and the ways that radicalizing public space in the 1960s and a radicalization of the movements of bodies in the space of the gallery allowed for the emergence of new kinds of critical and political art in that period. Today, Kellie Jones delivers her final lecture called Signs of Life, and I look forward to hearing her speak on street performance as conceptual strategy. I predict that this talk, like the Cohen lecture series as a whole, will not only describe but demonstrate how right in this room art can, in her words, coalesce a public, create a life for artists and audience, and a circle of friendships from the particular to the collective. Please give a warm welcome to Kellie Jones.
Yes, thank you so much, Carrie. Of course, you all should get her book and read her work on performance, because she's actually one of the leading scholars on performance art. So, on ideas of performance, and her work on Yvonne Rainer is legendary. So please, please, please make sure you see her work, and also she'll be here as a fellow, as a Du Bois Fellow next year. So you'll have the opportunity to be in close contact with her and her ideas, so that's great. I want to thank again everybody here, of course, the wonderful Henry Louis Gates Jr., the Hutchins Center, Richard Cohen, and everybody that I have met, you who are in the audience today, Intrepid for the last talk, but also Matt, Krishna, Vera, Avi, Dell, anybody else who I have missed, who is a part of the great Hutchins Center, just, what should I say, company, place, exuberance. Anyone else, of course, the great David Badman and the Image of the Black Project. And I've had a great time this week, so thank you in advance. Okay, let's get on with it. If practices of installation art opened up new spatial sensations in contemporary art, they also contributed to new understandings of the body. Installations defined larger expanses of space as art using a spectrum of materials. They were also fields of activity energized both by their constituent elements and the viewers that traversed them. The performativity of installations was linked to gesture, the signifying motion of objects in and of themselves and in juxtaposition. And, as we have seen, the artists under review used these constructs to create sites of memory where the human form could be both reinvented and abstracted. Embedded in the move from the performativity of installations to the location of performance is a shift from modernism's objet trouvé to the situation trouvée of postmodernism. It marks a change of focus from the material to the temporal. Most importantly, the body in motion, or simply the body in and of itself, is seen as constituting a legitimate substance of art and is freed from needing any object or specific construct to be interpolated as such. The temporal nature of performance not only changed art's relationship to issues of materiality, but to notions of space and time. A piece could be placed anywhere and everywhere and unfolded in what Adrian Piper has referred to as the indexical present. That is the here and now. These characteristics allowed performance to be dispersed quite effortlessly into the flow of everyday life as spectacle or political act. The territory of art was seen not as merely the domain of artists, but as an intellectual space that was shared by all. The image or word is always what Bakhtin calls a hybrid construction, mingling one's own word with the other's word. In this scenario, the artist, through his/her ongoing dialogical encounter with the world, is constantly processing and orchestrating the power of various voices and bringing them into view. The subtle and continuous movement between the passive position of object and active agency of subject, nominated by feminist theory as oscillation, was a defining characteristic of performance art of the 60s and 70s. Embedded in this unremitting slippage between the artist's clear construction of subjective meaning and his/her appearance as a work of art was a suspense factor borne out by the slowness of action, inane repetition, etc., that became a form of provocation, leading viewers to their own self-reflective moments and from empathetic identification with the subject to analytic judgment. However, artists as performers rejected the typical role of the actor, that is, the charismatic other, for a position as object placed in the course of mundane existence. By doing this, they neither affected a moral position of superior knowledge nor presented themselves as the embodiment of a collective unconsciousness that assumed a truth. Rather, through their presence, they sought to raise difficult questions and make visible a parity, a greater identification between cultural workers, their immediate communities, and society. Across a variety of conceptual modalities, this was achieved in part by bridging the divide between fine art and popular and vernacular form, or joining manifestations of high and low culture. In performance, artists turned to the comedic gesture found in variety theater, vaudeville, carpas, and that's Spanish for tent shows, as a way to elicit response and demolish seriousness. In the hands of Felipe Ehrenberg, it is telling that performances became conditions. He viewed them not so much as self-contained events or situations, a la Fluxus or situationism, respectively, but opportunities for the performativity of others. In his mind, artists created environments for art to happen in or for art to happen to people. conditions allowed for artists and viewers to draw on what Joseph Roach has identified as genealogies of performance, that is, expressive movements as mnemonic reserves. These gestures were remembered and imagined and constituted another aspect of collective representation. These more broadly drawn arenas of art as participation were also spaces of pedagogy, places of interrogation and developing awareness. If, as Ehrenberg once offered, figuration would remain a part of his own particular practice because of its greater potential for legibility with a larger audience, then the body in action was a cornerstone of his efforts to create art as a truly communicative medium. 3 exhibitions that span the 70s speak to Ehrenberg's approach to conceptualism in its performative guise and the framing of the condition as one which honored Mexican contexts and individual creativity. A 1973 solo show at Mexico City's Galeria Jose Maria Velasco, titled Chicles, Chocolates y Cacahuates, Gum, Chocolate, and Peanuts, was an overview of recent ideas in which the artist encouraged viewers to recite poetry, try out recipes and conceptual equations, and take part in the making of a cumulative sculptural piece. And you can see some of these equations and poetry here on the screen. And I'll translate them for you in a minute. Chicles, Chocolates y Cacahuates was a place where the community could also engage with part of the culture that had been censored. Government officials pronouncing certain drawings unfit had them covered with black paper, which could, however, be lifted up to view the work. But Ehrenberg used these shielding devices as a space for his own counter-commentary, adding such phrases as, censored because drunk children tell the truth. Another censored piece, this one shows a president of the Republic now dead. This work does not have permission to be viewed by the public. There was also a floor painting inscribed in 2 separate black squares, was the word gobierno, government, repeated over and over again. In one box, the words marched along in orderly fashion. In the other, their pattern was random. Positioned so that visitors would tread on them, one imagines the furtive paces that crushed government underfoot, although one writer noted that many went out of their way to avoid stepping on these government entities. And I'll come back to the translation. By 1975, Ehrenberg was back in Mexico living in Xico, a small town in the state of Veracruz. That year, he brought arguably the first experimental art show to the state capital of Jalapa. Conceptual art by Felipe Ehrenberg was held in paired spaces. The Museo Veracruzana de la Quincena, Veracruz Museum of the Fortnight, usually the home of the Alliance Française, and the Centro Regional de Ejercicios Culturales, Regional Center of Cultural Exercises, also Veracruz University's Department of Broadcasting. On display at the Museo Veracruzana was a series of drawings, somewhat surrealistic but solidly representational, called by the artist El Nuevo Muralismo Mexicano es Tamaño Doble Carta. The new Mexican muralism is legal size. This work was actually his attempt to recast Mexican muralism as a widely available and low-cost multiple. In Ehrenberg's scheme, the design for a mural created on paper roughly 11 by 14 inches or legal size, tamaño doble carta, could be rented by social organizations, which would then hire a sign painter to reproduce it in the desired scale, medium, wall, banner, or billboard, and context for union facilities, schools, etc. Besides attempting to resuscitate the accessibility and power of art, while divorcing it from concepts of the unique and precious, the artist's Nuevo Muralismo was a bid to save this august Mexican tradition from the quicksands of official bureaucracy and visual demagoguery. Having declared himself a neologist in 1970, it was no accident that the acronym for the second gallery, Centro Regional de Ejercicios Culturales, CRECE, sounded like the form of the word to grow, crecer. This space included more media-based works. One entire wall was covered with newspapers, Viewers were asked to underline a section of the news that spoke to them in whatever way, creating, at the exhibition's end, both an exquisite drawing and a meta-commentary on the popular press. Going through such motions provided people with new vantage points on the information they were bombarded with daily. And as I had mentioned yesterday, it's been harder for me to get some of the images of the Mexican artists. I still have to go to some archives to actually get these images because they're not easily or readily available. So what I'm showing you here, which is why I'm describing these performances, but because these things are ephemeral and they weren't supposed to be documented, a lot of it is descriptive. But what I'm showing you here on the bottom right is a piece related to the one I just described about the newspapers and the audience, Selección Informativa, news from the front, or Información Selectiva, Selección Informativa, news from the front. And the way this works is it's actually a piece of onion skin over a piece of newspaper, and you can actually move it and rotate it and select sections, and it blocks out certain sections of the picture and of the news. So it's really related to what he was doing and what is described in the piece that I just mentioned with the audience in 1975, and this is around this same time. The Museo Veracruzana and the Centro Regional de Ejercicios Culturales were linked not just by Ehrenberg's own discrete objects, but through the expanse in between them that was full to overflowing with everyday acts of art, people interacting with and actually generating the sights, sounds, and movement of the city, weaving their way among an environment filled with amazingly painted signs, decorated taxis and buses, and markets of beautifully arranged and idiosyncratic goods. In recognition of this font of creative genius, Ehrenberg designated the area in between his two gallery shows the art zone, and any act of any kind that happened there, no matter how subtle or quotidian, was recognized as important and as art. While Ehrenberg may have performed a few sly actions himself, creating an arena for the celebration of the collective imagination was the focus of the condition. Another way that Ehrenberg approached art as condition was through direct engagement with the audience in the guise of public interlocutor. One piece employing such strategies was part of a larger conference on Mexican art called the Tribune of Culture, held in December 1979 at Chapultepec Park. For his lecture demonstration titled The Story of Painting According to Me, Ehrenberg set out to relate his annotated version of the history of art from ancient times up to that moment. Ehrenberg's ambition for his lecture was twofold. He tried to demystify the creative process by offering a narrative on the making of objects, telling people in effect how it was done. However, he also sought to position cultural production as another form of labor and thus link the work of artists to the realities of all working people. Art was simply another occupation or form of toil, and Ehrenberg was intent on comparing the artist's role to that of the electrician or the university professor or to the doctor or plumber, in short, to any and all human activities which serve and have a place in society. The Story of Painting According to Me had an alternate title, Strings Fourth Variation, which revealed his Fluxus sensibilities and more fully described the action that took place that day. In documentation, chords flow from the artist's upper body, but primarily from his hands and wrists, into the assembled listeners, and behind him to a large metal frame from which hang the words, El arte es solo una excusa, art is just an excuse. As Ehrenberg elaborated in a 1983 interview, quote, art can provide an excuse to meet people and initiate friendships, or be used as a means to establish lines of communication within a community or between communities. But it can also be an excuse for ideological manipulation, the cultural arm of repressive political regimes, and a political ping pong ball, end quote. Sorry for this bit blurry here, this slide. As Ehrenberg moves back and forth in front of and into the gathering, the tension and orientation of the chords change, giving body to the maxim that floats behind him. But it is clear from these strings that this material connection between artist and audience remains somehow constant. Ehrenberg thus visualizes in concrete terms the linkages between artists and the rest of the world, how attached they are to society and to humanity in a larger sense. Ehrenberg's interest in the everyday, whether it was materials, actions, or locales, found a shared sensibility in the works of Senga Nengudi. While the pieces in visual terms appeared radically different, the artist's approaches to audience, community, and performance had much in common. Told that she didn't possess a dance body, Senga Nengudi went on to pursue visual art in college and still minored in dance. And it was through participatory three-dimensional pieces that movement and finally performance re-entered her work as an important creative force. Like many artists who took to the performative during this period, Nengudi did a number of undocumented as well as private works before stepping onto the vanguard's floodlit public stage. Some of her early forays were done in the company of other artists who formed the core of Studio Z. They were a loose group who came together at David Hammons' studio on Slauson Avenue, sometimes weekly, to engage in spontaneous actions. These might be performed in the streets of Los Angeles as well. Studio Z had a changing membership, including at various times Franklin Parker, Houston Conwell, Marin Hassinger, Ulysses Jenkins, and Rojo, along with Hammons and Nengudi. Hammons' space and huge old dance hall with a wooden floor was a perfect place to work out ideas. Okay, oops. Right. Nengudi's first full-length work of performance took place in March 1978. Ceremony for Freeway Fets was a public art project supported by a CETA grant and sponsored by Alonzo and Dale Davis's Brockman Gallery along with Caltrans, LA's transportation system. At a one-time event, it took place under a section of the freeway near the convention center at a point of confluence of various routes. Choosing to perform underneath the freeway might seem particularly transgressive or at least strange. But this was Los Angeles, where the raised concrete and steel roads represented the lifeline of a community, or in Roach's words, quote, the crux in the semiotext of the cityscape, end quote. Like other important pathways and landmarks of social exchange, it drew nascent audiences and performers, both voluntary and involuntary, who incessantly marked the spot with their actions. Such sites provided locales to exercise the kinesthetic imagination where dreamed, invented, or virtual movement played itself out in the habits and routines of the real. Ceremony for Freeway Fets began in the morning and it lasted for perhaps an hour. A small orchestra composed of students and artists played saxophone, flute, drums, and other less traditional instruments. Nearly everyone was equipped with a form of Nengudi sculpture, from Franklin Parker's knotted and twisted headdress to Rojo's full mask. Nengudi, Hassinger, and David Hammons provided the work's major movement. Hassinger's larger role in the piece was only confirmed that day. Hammons was already familiar with it and performed with his own decorated staff. Wearing a military-style jacket with epaulettes, go back to a larger picture, wearing a military-style jacket with epaulettes, unbuttoned and festooned with pantyhose sculpture, topped with a gauzy white veil, Hassinger spun wildly as if she herself was some centrifugal force. Nengudi's and Hammons' figures were designed more elaborately. Hammons' face was covered with black pantyhose, and the unused legs became antennae of sorts. He wore a black sweater complemented with shiny persimmon-colored pants and a wide belt. However, it is Nengudi who seems truly to bring to life her sculptural practice. Moving inside a tent-like structure, with each step, her performative silhouette changes radically. She is crowned by a gathering of stuffed and knotted nylon mesh and cloth scraps. On one side, where a hand might be, similar nylon forms cascade forth, punctuating the air emphatically and often. The loose theme of Ceremony for Freeway Fets was the relationship between black men and black women. Hassinger represented the female energy force and Hammons the male. Nengudi was the spiritual bond between them, linking the two polarities in a positive way. We can see similarities between ceremony for Fouye fetes and certain conventions of West African masquerade. For instance, there is the crew of masked performers, some in full body gear. Nengudi's version of her wearable sculpture culminates in a crown that appears to be placed on top of the head, calling to mind the elaborate wooden superstructures found in Yoruba Gelede masquerades, among others. In some African productions, such as Yoruba Egungun masquerades, the actual faces of performers are covered with mesh or folds of fabric, comparable in effect to Hammond's pantyhose-clad headpiece, sans eye holes. The object that spins in Nengudi's hand finds a comfortable analogy in the fly whisks and other items often carried by African performers. More broadly, the lesson of ancestral African performance was to promote good relations in one's village or environment. Such a concept could be extrapolated to the notion of Black unity in the US, especially in the era of the Black arts movement or the Black Power movement. Such an idea of art as relational form, using the body in concert with other materials, can be seen in contemporary works by Lourdes Grobet as well. By 1970, Lourdes Grobet had turned decisively to photography. Going forward, she would experiment with the medium in ways that pushed at the edges of its analytical and physical constructs. Una hora y media, hour and a half, of 1975 was one of Grobet's first solo performances. Was one of Grobet's first solo performances, is perhaps better described as a photographic happening. The artist was inspired to create the performance after viewing another exhibition of photographs. In that show, each image had been numbered in the style usually reserved for non-photographic prints. Grobet found this practice pretentious and unethical, since the numbers implied that the photographer had burned the negatives, something not usually practiced in this trade. Grobet's response took place at the Casa del Lago, a non-commercial gallery affiliated with the National Autonomous University of Mexico. The performance was designed as a lecture demonstration, and she outfitted the gallery with the trappings of a darkroom, including equipment for developing and printing images and safe lights. During the hour-and-a-half period, she described and illustrated the step-by-step methods of bringing a photographic image into being, working on 3 large images of herself emerging from a cardboard box. The condition was completed when Grobet hung the photographs on the wall, then switched on a large quartz lamp, which momentarily illuminated, then immediately dissolved the images. Purposefully, the artist had not chemically fixed the works, causing them to disappear in regular light. With this performance, Grobet both created and destroyed using light, reenacting in her own way the burning alluded to in the exhibition of numbered photographs. In vandalizing some of her own images and those which no less depicted her own body, she hoped to also decimate the myth of photographs as serious and permanent documents and reveal their vulnerability as containers of veracity and history. Una hora y media also interrogated how one might fix an image, that is, hold on to ephemeral sensations and impressions and appeal to memory. After a less than enthusiastic and indeed angry reception to Una hora y media, Grobet left for England. There, between 75 and 77, her experimentations revolved around creating conceptual objects and conditions that would catch the public's eye. To this end, much of what she did do was fun. She invented situations of amusement and pleasure that she hoped would still communicate the complexity of changing notions of photography. Perhaps with the 75 performance in mind, she endeavored to create a space that more clearly advanced a dialogical relationship with the audience. As someone who had voluntarily uprooted herself from familiar terrain, the artist became interested in the connotations of the traveling show. How would the meaning of objects be changed by a new context, Could the idea of motion be engaged as a concrete entity, and to what effect? In dialogue with this concept, she organized her own traveling exhibition in 1976 at Derby College of Art and Technology. It consisted of a series of photographs installed in an elevator. And there they are. In this scenario, Grobet created a situation where changing audiences and shifting locales were dictated by a combination of chance and certainty in constant flux. In 1976, Britain also held a year-long series of festivities and counter-festivities commemorating the 25th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's reign of the English monarchy. Grobet joined in these activities by presenting her own homage to the Silver Jubilee. She photographed a variety of everyday objects in collision with each other, printed them up in black and white at sizes of 8 by 10 inches or smaller, then affixed them to her body and moved through and outside of a gallery show to which she was an invited participant. Called Jubileo de Plata, this piece was a literal translation of the English phrase, which took on an entirely different meaning in Spanish. As used by the artist, this title signified a sort of silver frolic or romp, indicated by the widely careening objects, Grobet's body in motion, and the silver in the chemicals which brought the images into being. She performed the related walking exhibition, which you see on the screen, the following year. In Grobet's mind, photography could revitalize a role usually ascribed to history painting. The medium's ability to record the flow of everyday life could be transformed, amplified to give daily struggles the import of epic narrative. Because neither camera nor photographer were static, the images themselves could remain true to lived experience by expressing its constitutive physical actions. In other words, photography as history maintained its connection to the performative nature of existence. In the US, Adrian Piper too explored the epic edges of daily life with a focus on heterogeneity, difference, and ultimately race. In an essay from 1972 titled "Performing Objects I Have Been," Adrian Piper outlines a variety of disparate events in her life that have shaped her approach to the art of performance. Some of these milestones seem to have a more curious and tenuous link to the genre. Keeping a journal from age 11, going to a psychiatrist, practicing yoga, studying philosophy. Others provide a more understandable connection: a stint as an adolescent fashion model, working as a discotheque dancer, dressing in costume and promenading with an assorted band of transvestites. At the age of 24, Piper is both able to identify her subjectivity as an artist and a woman, and to comprehend her place as an object in certain schemes of the larger world. Her performances begin with her investigation of these two poles of existence, viewing the body as active subject and as passive object. One of her first performances mining these polarities, untitled Performance for Max's Kansas City, performed during the spring of 1970, took place at this famous watering hole of New York's art crowd. Here, Piper presented her figure as a hapless contraption in need of direction, requiring protection, care, and guidance. What she discovered, however, was that her roving presence became a hostile act, constituting a passive-aggressive threat to the order of things. In quoting her, she says, "I learned that complete absorption was impossible because my voluntary object-like passivity implied aggressive activity and choice, an independent presence confronting the art-conscious environment with its autonomy. My objecthood became my subjecthood." It was her desire to explore the shifting nature of people's understanding of bodies in action that led Adrian Piper to perform Catalysis between 1970 and 72. In these performances, the artist turned herself into an abject apparition, walking around, riding the subway at rush hour, going shopping or to a museum with gooey, smelly clothing, with gum on her face, or terry cloth towels stuffed in her mouth, using public facilities which usually require quiet, such as a library, while carrying a concealed tape recording of loud belching, holding monologues with herself in public. Here, art became a catalytic agent, something that promoted change in another entity, the viewer, without undergoing any permanent change itself. Piper was interested in people's reactions to the situation, or what she called the, quote, uninterpreted as art presence, end quote, a circumstance unmediated by a museum or theatrical setting. What she experienced was that people could overcome the disgust, anger, fear of difference and make connection with others. The experience with catalysis led her to further examine the ways in which difference was integrated into society's structures. Rather than approaching variation as aberration from an unspecified norm, the mythic being performances of 70 to 76 considered alternate reality, conscious identity, and lived experience. The artist's fascination with the potential fluidity of subject-object positions shifted as she began to focus more on the divide between self and other, and later, how such questions implicate race. Piper constructed the mythic being as a masculine version of herself by considering her past history and reversing its effects on her gendered body. In addition to a physical script, Piper provided her character with a spoken plotline drawn from prior autobiographical musings found in her journal. Almost simultaneously, the mythic being appeared in interventions in the gallery advertising pages of the Village Voice, drawings and offset posters. These two-dimensional works included the same text that the mythic being recited in performance, exploring the concept of alienation both in terms of how it played out within wider societal structures and as a function of inner doubts and misgivings. These verses became mantras, articulated over and over again until their sounds were spiritual and public speech, and any autobiographical content was entirely depersonalized and dispersed. The mythic being was thus an archetypal figure inhabiting a communal consciousness. The artist moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1974 to pursue a doctorate in philosophy at Harvard. While initially continuing with the public projects in the Village Voice and other works on paper, the mythic being's performative guise was put in the closet. However, Piper performed again in the summer of '75, reviving the mythic being as a foil for many of her fantasies of power and aggression brought on by the oppressiveness of the predominantly white male academic environment. This was a space heavily circumscribed by the parameters of, quote, family, class, ethnicity, gender, and schooling, end quote, from which she was so distant that she felt, quote, above it, below it, inside it, and beyond it all at once, end quote. In the mythic being, Getting Back, our man is angered by a white male who confronts and apparently disrespects him, who he then follows and subsequently mugs. One of 3 photographs for the mythic being cruising white women shows the disguised Piper hanging out in Harvard Square checking out the chicks. And that's on the top. At this point, Piper's actions as the mythic being became a way to deal with and control the exigencies of an almost invisible disaffection from her surroundings based on difference. As she would write a decade later, the mode of performance allowed her to fly, quote, soaring back and forth, reflectively circling around above the specificity and immediacy of things and events in space and time from a perspective that embedded them in a conceptual framework of increasing breadth and depth, end quote. From the exploration of the other inside of the self, the mythic being shifted to become a symbol of alienation and anger, a figure of public consciousness who was the incarnation of the myriad aspects of pain and disaffection shared by the multitude. His further estrangement was coded by race. As Coco Fusco has written, his image, quote, dramatized through masquerade how social forces projected racial meaning onto bodies, end quote. Indeed, the phenomenology of racial identity and the pathology of racism would surface as predominant themes in the artist's mature work. Through multimedia installations and performance, Piper challenged viewers to probe their own social attitude As she stated, racism was not, quote, an abstract, distant problem that affects all those poor, unfortunate other people out there. It begins between you and me, right here and now. As we have seen, the body and performance could be considered concurrently as object and subject, as work of art, and the bearer of a certain subjectivity. At the same time, this individual subject, the incarnation of personal history, also embodied a fragment of the collective, and the conditions of this larger reality were etched as memory on the body of the performer. As Carlos Monsiváis has suggested, the body insinuates that which is difficult to name. Speaking of Cantinflas, whose lapses of verbal intelligibility accompanied by lucid and often lewd physical antics made him one of the most popular comedians of 20th century Mexico, he writes, quote, his body gestures organize the chaos of his words. Cantinflismo is the double language of that which seeks to be expressed and that which does not feel like being thought, end quote. Such circumstances where repression may be in the specter of censorship, the act of exclusion from official social institutions of representation, or the form of physical brutality, makes for art that increasingly relies on an array of double-voiced, allegorical, and parodic strategies. For these cultural practices and their producers, there is a twinning of audience, of meaning, and of understanding. What looks avant-garde may be a fragment of lived experience. What presents itself as just art has an agenda of underground signification. In the African American situation, writes Gray Guntecker, certain conceptual and metaphoric resources are brought to bear on circumstances which help, quote, foreground insider knowledge over mastery of forms attributed to European sources. However, the key to such visual metaphors is simply that one feature, or occasionally two, lifts up to notice as a contextual, interpretive clue, while others fade into the background, end quote. The actions by Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and other African American members of the U.S. track and field team at the 1968 Olympic Games showed that gestures of protest were not confined to street demonstrations, strikes, or other more recognizable types of political activity, but that they permeated the gamut of social and cultural life. It seems no accident, then, that conceptual art developed during this same period, and while certain examples were overtly political, such as the installations of Proceso Pentágono, others worked at the level of social or institutional critique that was more subtle. In all cases, however, there was interaction with institutions of production, distribution, and reception in critical, conflicted, and revitalizing ways, providing something more than currency composed of objects. And even if the materials in and of themselves were identifiable, their content was made to signify in different ways. It was for this reason that in 1970, Felipe Ehrenberg rejected the label of artist for that of neologist. As he explained, quote, neologism is a way of assuming an attitude to decipher the proliferation of new symbols that are surging each moment. There will always be a need to amplify language to describe the advances of knowledge, end quote. Mexican critic Rita Eder has pointed out that conceptualism's use of temporal and ephemeral constructs should be seen as part of a philosophy of rupture rather than simply considered an evolution of style. There was more than a casual relationship between the dematerialized practices of the 60s and 70s and the parallel rebellion against cultural and institutional authority. In the move from minimal to process, from the sheen of the commercial and industrial to the exploded forms of the de-objectified object, critic Ursula Mayer saw anthropomorphic work that returned meaning to the conditions of the body. Denied its upright stance, it falls to the ground, prone and spineless. However, such configurations of bits and pieces from which the new object was composed seem not simply to be proxies for the human form, but describe the body in distress. Suggestive of the human condition, these works cowered helplessly on the ground, prostrate, accessible to the next blow. These were the materials that formed installations. If we consider the creations discussed here, most of the artists accessed this connotation of the anguished body. Such sensations could be found in Nengudi's sagging pantyhose constructions after black wet nurses whose energies were drained. Grobet's serendipity presented room after room of body parts and fragments, while Proceso Pentágono alluded again and again to victims of disappearance and torture. It would follow that similar emotions and an understanding of the body and associations of violence would be transferred to the art of performance as well. Piper created an image of the distressed and misshapen body in the catalysis performances and used it as a vehicle for exploring the self-other divide. This certainly seemed to be the case with Una Hora y Media, Grobet's darkroom instruction as performance, which conflated the chemical burning of the photograph with the description of the image it contained, in this case, a picture of the artist herself. Writing of the Latin American context, Jean Franco sees the revaluation of corporeal processes and sensibilities as evincing an underlying desire to transfer all that was spiritual, ideal, and abstract to the material level, to the sphere of the body. What she calls resacralization was a reaction to the specific political violence that increasingly plagued the region from the 60s to the 80s. Out of this, women, and specifically mothers, emerged as one of the few sectors that was allowed to visibly dissent against the brutality advanced by governments in the name of their citizenry. In Argentina and Chile, in particular, women's protest and civil disobedience took the form of ritual drama, making use of performance, pilgrimage, and costume, as well as photography. With such models, performance as art came to be seen as a way to construct an ethical self. Grobet's Jubileo de Plata and walking exhibition seems to gloss these Latin American practices formally, if not in content, bringing us back to notions of double voicing. And you see them on the screen there. Yet other performances appeared in some ways more conciliatory, focusing on the process of community construction over the destruction of its forces. Nengudi's ceremony for freeway fetes was an invocation of peace and unity between the sexes. In Ehrenberg's The Story of Painting, according to me, the connection to the larger populace was made tangible through linking lines of communication. By recontextualizing the role of the artist as a cultural worker whose contribution to the world was like that of other laborers in society, Ehrenberg not only made a place for himself, but stressed the reintegration of wholeness of a country ripped apart by the violence of the preceding decade. What is clear from these examples in both installation and performance is that though the human subject may have been buried or deconstructed, it never vanished altogether. This was true even with pieces using text and language. Marceau's concrete poetry could not exist without people's participation. Ehrenberg's mail art piece, Arriba y Adelante, also required such engagement. But the bodily connotation was further inscribed by the resulting image, an erotic nude. Piper's 3 models for art production systems of 1970 was an instructional example to be used by someone to make art. In graphic works by Hammons, even as the visible human form of the late 60s gave way to one further delineated by language in the spade pieces of the 70s, the tool for their construction remained the body itself. The body did not disappear from the work of these Mexican and African American artists because the subject could not. For in life, these were people whose existence was challenged daily by the exigencies of political and racial violence. In art, they were constantly disappeared from the Western canon and the historical record. The greater difficulty was, in fact, holding on to selfhood and subjectivity. For these same reasons, the body and the body politic had to continually reassert itself in these works by Mexican and African American artists, either by way of the image, the performative, or through the participation of the population at large. Conceptual art allowed for a greater expansion of meaning, but the disintegration of form on another level also signaled the dispersal of the subject, which at its core was a problematic proposition. If conceptualism as a form of abstraction was, in the words of Adrian Piper, flying and circling around above the specificity and meaning of things, Then these artists continually touched down, using the body as image, material, or as palpable presence. They ensured their connection to subjectivity and to life. Thank you. Thank you. I got it honest. Thank you, Skip. Questions. Anybody with questions? As I look for my tissues, maybe not. Hi.
Thank you. That was, I'm not sure. Better if it's not on, but that was so fascinating and wonderful to think through these artists in the larger context of conceptual art.
I can
You can hear me. Okay.
Okay.
Is that better?
Now,
Okay.
now
good.
I can hear you. Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes.
So wonderful. Really interesting to think through these artists in the larger context of conceptual art and performance. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about Nengudi, because I don't know, I was just thinking about your wonderful idea of sort of art as a mode of connecting people and a site of connection, and then that performance takes place at what I've always thought of the sort of freeway in LA and other cities as like a dividing line and a sort of site of stratification and division, and wondering about, and I've always approached Adrian Piper in the same way, as thinking about division and exposing contradiction and sort of confronting the contradictions in society. So I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on how you see the Nengudi performance as being, I don't know, I wonder if the sort of the idea of the mediator between men and women could be seen more critically as well, or if you do really see it as a means of sort of knitting people together.
Great question. Thank you very much. Yes, I do still see it as, we'll start with Nengudi, knitting people together. I mean, freeways do connect people. They do, there's two things. And you pointed out exactly right. I mean, the freeway movement and urban renewal in general, cut people off. Urban renewal for freeways was contested, and many times it ran through neighborhoods that were poor neighborhoods and African American neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods, and especially in LA, we can think of that happening quite a bit. So we can think of this as a way to heal that, right? To perform. If we think about it as the way African performances work, because she's glossing that in many ways, that many masquerades are about bringing calm to a village, appeasing spirits, appeasing, in this case, a wild forest that may encroach on you, animals, enemies that hide their bad spirits or bad ancestors that you haven't appeased very well. You dance and you masquerade to protect, to offer conciliation, to offer libations and things like that. So we can really see this as a way to think about the freeway and appease that, what's been going on, and make it whole again. Another way to think about it is also the same way through Joe Roach, which talks about how people, particularly in Mardi Gras, parade on routes that are not really designated, and they go around these type of spaces, what in Spanish I talked about yesterday as the arrabal, which is the kind of marginal spaces in the city. So there's this idea of the marginal space, right, that is being walked through in Roach's terms as well, paraded through to control it, to find one's place in it. So we can really see this as well here with that work. In Adrian Piper's work, her work is, what it is? It's the rhetorical flourish, as getting that from Skip just now, the rhetorical flourish. Yes, her rhetoric that makes you think that it's really not about, joining people together, because she's pointing out inequities. But as she says in what I quoted, to deal with racism starts right here, right now with you and me in the indexical present, which is her statement, right? Like, so we're going to deal with it now. So it really is about having an exchange, and it's really about working it out. So I would actually say that it is about joining, again, even though what she writes or how she puts it may be a little bit more standoffish in that way. Yeah, working through that, and we say we should do that as scholars. We've got to work through all your, problems in your text, so you can do it with people as well. Any other questions?
I have the mic.
Carrie, go ahead. Do you want to? Yes, I mean, I just want to come back to the 1960s and the late 1960s, and I got very friendly with Charles Harrison a few years back, and I was very struck by his career, and in some ways quite parallel to my own, which was around about 1967 or 8. He decided somehow that the art world had finished in some sort of way. And I remember having a sort of similar feeling at that point. And our directions, of course, went in a totally different, we went totally different ways. But do you think that there's something that happened around then that made people extremely disillusioned with the art world and felt, and I know that Charles Harrison felt that really Jackson Pollock was really the last sort of real artist in a sense. But I mean, is there something happening around that time, do you think?
Thanks for that question, David. I think it's really what people don't talk about, which is the context of the world. Violence, protest, we want change, death. Also what these African American artists are responding to, well, Adrian says it herself, I'm responding to war. These things, language does not work. Art that is only language will not work for her anymore. That was in my first lecture, right, where I said, it's not going to work. So she goes to this other mode. And it's also interesting that, we can also think about in LA with the LA artists, people getting killed. Black Panthers are in California. That's where the movement starts. Not in LA, but in Northern California in 1966. But, in that decade, let's say between 66 and 76, how many people were killed, by the police? Just let's talk about Black Panthers. We won't even talk about anybody else. So people are seeing violence. David Hammons is stopped on the street during this time because he does strange things to his body, and he walks around the street, and he gets stopped by the police. Other artists get stopped by the police as well. So, they're responding to a world in which these things are happening. But it's also interesting to think about, I go back to my LA project, when, the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles opens in the 50s and is, like the go-to gallery for, the development of this LA scene. Everybody talks about it, there are books about it. In the year that it closes, a gallery, Brockman Gallery, which showed David Hammons and others, which I've also mentioned in this talk, or these talks, opens. And it's open for 22 years. So it's really also a shift between how Harrison felt about what he was seeing in the world and what these artists felt was the blossoming, their final ability to, kind of control and make a mark on the world. So it's a different spectator. It's a different approach to what they're seeing. I think it's just two different perspectives on what's going on. Yeah. Carrie?
Again, I'm so sorry I couldn't be here yesterday, but I was hoping to hear you talk a little bit about your choice in terms of talking about African American and Mexican artists in particular. And that's it's been a really illuminating an interesting conjunction, but of course it kind of raises the question of, and what about Canadian artists, or what about, so why those two sets of artists in particular?
I did mention this a little yesterday, but I will mention it for you, of course, again, and also for people who are not here. People have asked me that, of course, and they say, why are you not talking about Mexican artists and Chicano artists? Or why are you not talking about African Americans and Chicano artists? And my answer is that it really starts with their shared history, and I'm sorry Skip has left because he helped me out yesterday in terms of putting in some historical dates, but a shared history that at least goes back to the Harlem Renaissance and the Mexican mural Renaissance, and what those artists saw, many American artists went down to Mexico, of course, when the mural Renaissance happened, but African American artists were among them. Hale Woodruff, Charles White, and Elizabeth Catlett, who stayed and left her husband, Charles White, and married a Mexican, Pancho Mora. So there's that shared history, but African Americans saw in the work of those artists, and I'm putting the mural movement up here now, David Siqueiros, Portrait of the Bourgeoisie, 39, and Charles White, Contribution of the Negro to Democracy, what they saw in a kind of valorization of history, of struggle, of ethnicity, spoke to them in a different way. Again, as David was saying, what's the difference between Charles Harrison and Adrian Piper or these artists? So it spoke to them in a different way. And then we can go back to the fact that Mexico, offered a space of freedom before this country. If we think about, slavery, if we go back to the 19th century, and also going back even further to think about how many people were brought from Africa to the Americas. Most of them went to Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, of course, that's not talked about a lot, and there are areas of Black Mexico, for instance, in Veracruz, and other places. So there is that connection that is really not talked about. But also another connection that I made was about, people always talk about Brazil and the US, and they talk about black populations, and it's perfectly okay, right? But the reality is that in this period, Brazil is under a dictatorship, right? US isn't. You have political violence, but we're not in a dictatorship as far as I know. Neither is Mexico, even though there's political violence. So actually, that connection actually works even better because of this kind of shared history and this idea of political violence, and racial violence. So that's my answer to that one. You're welcome.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm really sad that I didn't get to take a class with you when I was in your department, but yeah, I finished undergrad there, but.
At Columbia?
Yeah, at Columbia.
Sorry.
I know,
Tell your friends
it's really
if
sad
you're
for me.
still
But I wanted to talk about the piece Una Hora y Media, which is so fascinating.
Yes, yes.
Just as a point of information, I'm curious, would the audience have known going into it that the sort of backstory of what had happened to her negatives, that they had been destroyed? And I'm curious sort of how you view the moment of backlash and that negative reaction that you say was really strong to her. I'm seeing this sort of as her taking an ownership and sort of asserting her agency in eliminating her own photographs. I'm just curious sort of how you read that, that interaction.
This is a great question because I'm wanting to point this out because as I've mentioned, the images that I have of the Mexican artists, I'm not as happy with as I am with the African Americans. I have much more images, and these are much more, there's much more, or some more archival work to find the actual images that I need. But if you notice, she says she didn't save the pictures, but why do I have a picture here? Right?
I was really confused by the contradiction.
It's very confusing,
there.
isn't it? Mm-hmm. Right. And so this is the whole idea of what performance is. So she supposedly burned these negatives or, didn't fix the image, right? But there is a negative that she obviously didn't burn. Now, in the description, that I have, one description I have says, she's coming out of a box and she's nude. She is not coming out of a box and she is not nude. But these are not, so I do think they are around from the same time because she's young and beautiful, and her hair, and knowing how she looks later on, she doesn't, this is how she looks during this period, more or less. So it's very confusing, but it's just like, it's typical performance art. It's like, oh no, we're gonna rant against, selling and commodification and all this stuff and buying and selling the image and the image of my body, and I'm not gonna do it. And then all of a sudden the image shows up. And she wasn't critiquing, her images of, when she's critiquing this idea of, numbered prints. It's somebody else's show, right? So she's critiquing another show that was, much more formal.
I see,
and not her own work. So it's very confusing, and I do need to do some more work on this to find is there an image, to really talk to her and say, okay, what's going on, because the description is wrong, or is it right, or what's going on here, because she's not nude, she's not in a box, or maybe this is maybe I just got it wrong, which is highly possible, which is probably what you'll tell me. But I mean, this is, as Professor Lambert-Beatty knows, how these things, this kind of disconnect between, accounts of the time, accounts by the artist later, or even at the time, and what you actually find later. And what gets, then all of a sudden, a beautiful catalog comes out of this artist after you've been working on her, and there's this picture, and you're like, okay. So it's part of the whole wonder of this area. So thanks for that. Other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
Conceptual art, it seems like the history of it is recorded in their own writing, like all these people's writing. You read a lot of it. And it's so different from some other forms of visual art where it's the actual object, and most of them didn't even take the time to document, because that wasn't important, right?
Right.
So how does that get written into art history differently than something else?
Well, you rely a lot on written text. There are things, we're far away enough from the time that things have started to appear. And there are archives of people that you go to, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, But it's archival work, it's oral histories, looking, I think some of the things that have helped me the most in this period is actual newspaper accounts and reviews of the time, because they're there looking at it, and they're also not the artist. So, part of me privileges that, but I think you really have to balance all these things, and then, make your own account of what happened, and then, could be a few years later, oops, you didn't know about this. But I mean, I think that happens with art history in general, but it is a challenge. I mean, more than one person has decided not to study or write about this period because it is challenging in that way. But, a lot of art history, very ancient things are also challenging as well, Hi.
I was also wondering about the reception of the historical avant-garde in Mexico, which it's not something I know absolutely nothing about, but I was seeing a connection in Ehrenberg to Lizitzky and Presa with the información selectiva. I don't speak Spanish, but I wonder if you could explain that work more. It sounded so interesting with the onion skin that can be sort of shifted over.
Right.
And it reminds me immediately of Presa, and then the art as solo una excusa also seems to signal a link to Duchamp and the string sort of both connecting people and sort of obscuring the art from the site of reception. Anyway, I was just curious if you could talk more about that.
Oh, good. Great questions. Yeah, well, also constructivism and geometricism are very important in Latin America throughout the 20th century. So we can see that in his work. He also is in Europe for part of the time in the 68 to 74, and he's in England, so he's also dealing a lot with fluxus, which is where he's getting, some of these things as well. So he is, looking back, he's there and he's looking back as well at earlier forms, but also very much involved in current neo-avant-garde practices like fluxus. So that's one way we can think about his work. And then the string. Yeah, well, actually, I had that slide yesterday, but it was with installation. To not talk about Ehrenberg, though, but it's interesting to talk about David Hammons, because I had seen how he had kind of put those things together. He's a big fan of Duchamp, although he says he's not. And I had seen that and that. But you can really, it's a good way to think about this. But see, with the Duchamp, though, it's more obfuscating. And so that's why I would say it's actually not quite as much like that. It's actually much more related to fluxus, in terms of conditions and actions and things like that. And the linking, it's really about, these strings go out to people. So it's, in a way, maybe the string idea, it could be, fluxus is also, looking back at Dada as well. So it's not surprising that, Duchamp would be, invoked or lurking, yes, is a better word, there. But I do think it's a little bit different because it has I think Duchamp really wanted that to, in a way, stop you, to create a larger environment, in a way, obfuscate what you were looking at. And this is a little bit different from that. Yeah. Krishna, did you have a question?
I've been really looking forward to today's lecture because I wanted the mystery of your lecture title to be solved. And so I'm glad you spoke about Ehrenberg and the strings. But as a layperson, I'm still a little confused. If he says art is an excuse for the connections or can be used for domination, then is art still peripheral to the project? What is the importance of art then if it's only an excuse and not a tool per se?
Yes, it's a great question. It's a fake out. These are artists who are trying to be part of a larger population. So they're just saying, oh, no, I'm not really doing art. David Hammons says that all the time, too. And actually, if I had translated it better, it would have been art is only an excuse, right? But I put art as an excuse, and I did that because there's also a woman in Los Angeles who starts organizing it different in my LA project, because I keep thinking about that, too, now I'm just blanking on her name. It just left me. That's terrible, but it will come back. Who talks about, she starts doing art because she's really trying to do civil rights organizing, but she knows that, proper people won't come out for civil rights organizing, but they'll come out for art. And so art becomes an excuse for organizing. So in that way, it's a cover. It's also obfuscating in a different way. So art as an excuse is actually a way to make you think that you're just doing something light, but actually you're doing something much more important. So, yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you.